Today, we are discussing policy that literally is out of this world. In today's topic, we are discussing space policy and more specifically about the Space Force, the newest and sixth branch of the U.S. Armed Services. I have two guests with me today to share with you some of the key elements of how the Space Force has taken off in Congress and beyond. Let's begin. Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. We've got a couple of great guests joining us today, talking about something that is literally about something that it's outside of this world, out of this world, space policy. That's right, we're going to be covering space policy, but more specifically on the United States Space Force, the newest branch to the U.S. Armed Forces. Before we get started, as a kind reminder, make sure you subscribe and share this podcast and episode with your friends and family so more people can enjoy amazing content every single week. Mondays released, available at 6 a.m. Eastern. So make sure you subscribe. And now I will be introducing our two guests today. My first guest is my former classmate and now friend, Nick Cartwright. Nick serves as the legislative liaison for the Space Force Association, the SFA. He recently assisted in creating Congressional Space Force caucuses for the newest U.S. military branch in the U.S. House and Senate. Nick is a 2020 graduate of the Bush School of Government, where he received an MPSA degree concentrating in national security policy. Nick received a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science and History from Abilene Christian University, where he graduated with honors. While an undergraduate student at ACU, Nick interned for Congressman Lamar Smith, who recently retired, by the way. Congressman Lamar Smith was then chairman of the U.S. House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. While at the Bush School, Nick interned for the U.S. House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, working on space policy issues, and heavily participated in drafting the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2019, H.R. 3610. Check it out on congress.gov, and has made many valuable relationships with several members of Congress. Nick has worked on several congressional and state-level campaigns while in college. Nick has been accepted into several doctoral programs, and he will be continuing his education next fall. My second guest is Eric Sundby. Eric serves on the board of directors for the Space Force Association. He currently leads initiatives to create a Congressional Space Force caucus and foster bipartisan support for the newest U.S. military branch. Amongst other projects outside of SFA, he established and helps run an international nonprofit which recovers stolen, valuable cultural art pieces, and has taught aerospace sciences to students K-12, and has worked as an aide for a U.S. congressman and on a campaign for a Texas state representative. He holds a BA in economics from the University of Oklahoma, and a Master of Science in Global Security from the University of Glasgow, where he had a thesis that argued for the development of the Space Force, and a graduate certificate in commercial space studies from the Florida Institute of Technology. Eric's professional interests lie in the uses and applications of space for defense and commercial purposes, with particular focus on strategic uses benefiting the United States. He enjoys living at his ranch in the Texas Hill Country with his two dogs, and is engaged to be married in January 2021. So Eric and Nick, welcome to Friends and Fellow Citizens. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Sherman. Glad to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Good to talk to you again.
I'm going to start off with you, Nick, on the United States Space Force. This is a new branch of the U.S. military, And maybe not a lot of people are very familiar with the functions of the Space Force. So could you walk through a bit of the background, the creation, and the functions of this new sixth branch of the U.S. military?
Yeah, so it was created last year in the National Defense Authorization Act. It had kind of been in the pipeline for a long time before that, but it finally came into fruition last year during the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. Before that, it was just functions of the U.S. Air Force, and those functions split off and became its own separate military branch. And Eric is going to speak on more of the minute functions that they perform as well.
Yeah, so with that, it being established in last December of 2019. Before that, to give a little bit more background so people do understand, the Space Force was nothing new out of an idea. There had been attempts at reorganizing our national security space administration and management. For instance, in I believe 2001, there was a Rumsfeld Space Commission that focused on the management and organization of our national security space. And I think that began in 1999. It actually advocated for the reorganization of our space assets in our armed forces. There were some, and I believe Neil deGrasse Tyson was also one of them who actually advocated that having a separate military service might be more effective. Again, in the Allard Commission, I believe around 2008, was another commission in which the Congress and the United States government tried to investigate and assess the possibility of organization and change of management of our national security space. Also in 2017, there were two representatives, Mike Rogers, a Republican from Alabama, and Jim Cooper, a Democrat from Tennessee, both of whom drafted some legislation that would have created a Space Corps. And so I just like to let everybody know that this actually has a lot of history behind it. It's not something that came about so recently due to President Trump's support behind creating a new service. It has existed for some time. In regards to what the Space Force does, it predominantly, a lot of people, when they saw it stand up, they heard satellites. And that's what everybody kept saying was that, well, they deal with satellites. And that is true. They do protect national security space assets, satellites in space, in all areas of orbit. That could be low Earth orbit, geosynchronous, geostationary, and others. But these assets are for both monitoring the Earth for various reasons, weather, military operations, reconnaissance, telecommunications, and are something that a lot of people have certainly heard, our global positioning system, our GPS. And so that historically has been one of the primary, I shouldn't say one of the primary, but the primary mission of space forces. And it continues to be. However, I think that those functions are going to be changing rapidly within the next decade to 2 decades, and probably even quicker than that. And we're going to start seeing some really interesting things happening with what the Space Force is going to be doing in space. And we're obviously going to get into that, later on here.
Yeah, just like a lot of things in the government, it just takes a lot of time, right? With the bureaucracy and the support and the opposition is kind of all mixed together. Now let's bring the Space Force more into context with what both of you do. Eric, I'll start off with you this time. Walk us through the purpose and the work of the association that you work for, the Space Force Association.
Every military branch, generally there is a organization, a nonprofit entity that represents the interests of the individuals who work within those armed forces or that branch. And you can look around. There's the Air Force Association. There's the Association of the U.S. Army. There's the Association of the U.S. Navy. There's the Naval League, the Marine Corps Association, so on and so forth. So obviously, we believed that it was just natural for the Space Force Association to stand up, especially to be an advocate for the new branch. The new branch, there's a lot of people in just in general, in the public at large, and some prominent individuals who don't really understand, one, what the Space Force does, but why it exists. And that's a lot of uphill battle that we're going to have to be dealing with. And so we thought that, all we want to do is be an advocate for those individuals that work in the Space Force, and to help the Space Force in any way so it can carry out its mission and carry out its mission effectively. So really what we do, to summarize it, is that we focus on representing those individuals, those space professionals. They don't have a specific title yet. We've heard some titles come out like Sentinel or Vanguard, and it's going to be interesting to see what ends up being the finalized title. But we're here to represent them. We're here to help the Space Force in whatever way possible, if that is educational outreach to the general public or to our congressional members, and to the executive offices as well. That is what we're here to do. And I think that, as a young and small organization, I think we've been carrying out that mission effectively so far.
Great. And Nick, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what I do, kind of how I got involved with this. So Eric and I are sitting together recording this podcast. That's because we're from the same hometown outside of San Antonio. We actually went to high school together, and we met in junior ROTC about 10 or 11 years ago. And we've just remained in touch all this time. So Eric asked me to help him do some legislative work for the Space Force Association, and our primary task was to create the Space Force Caucus in the U.S. Senate, and we did that way ahead of schedule. So after that, we started working in the House, U.S. House of Representatives, to do the same thing, and we accomplished that way ahead of schedule as well. So now we just maintain those relationships with those members of Congress and senators. And so what I do is I act as a liaison between the Space Force Association and the different members of Congress and staffers that we work with on both the House and the Senate. And then we connect also with the top brass of the U.S. Space Force. So we act as a channel between both different entities. So that's what we do.
And he does a very good job at it. I mean, one of the things that he focuses on is making sure that our congressional members have that they're educated, that they hear all views, all sides. That's one thing. Is some people have looked at the Space Force Association and Space Force Caucus, and they thought that they were very tied. And that's not necessarily true. The caucus is its own independent entity. We have no control over members of Congress or a caucus. We simply just offer them educational material, background on some of the things that are affecting the Space Force. As it is in its infancy. That's what we're here for, is to just be a strong advocate for them and help them with anything they need, particularly when it comes to congressional politics.
Well, I think what you guys do is just so important. I, as a congressional intern myself last year, I can tell you how important it is to have forums and organizations that support particular causes. It really brings people from both sides of the aisle together on certain issues. Depends on the caucus, but I think something like this is really valuable. And you mentioned the educational aspect to it. I think it's also going to be incredibly important for staffers and for members of the general public to learn what their members of Congress are doing on space policy. And that leads me now to our second grand topic on space policy issues. The first I want to focus on is now on military space operations. We hear about other countries getting involved in this new domain of space policy and space operations. So Eric, walk us through some of the top issues that you are dealing with regards to military space operations.
Sure. So, that that's a really good point where you brought up that many other countries are getting involved in this. Just to let your listeners know, we do have the only separate individual branch focused on space in the world right now. However, we weren't the first. The Russian Federation had their own space forces that was a separate branch from their other military branches. It has been done before. I think that the way that we're doing it is the most innovative way. Not only has Russia had space forces, one fact is that they have dissolved those and moved them back together with, I think, some strategic rocket troops and also the air forces. So they created the Russian Aerospace Force. And there are other countries such as China that created the Strategic Support Force, which is a part of the People's Liberation Army. Every other branch in the Chinese military has to be a part of the People's Liberation Army. It is part of their communist constitution. It's part of that line of thinking and how their organization functions. I think that it is really important to focus on how organizations function and how they are set up, because that is how you are going to be able to carry out effective operations. And so that comes to your, what are these military space operations that we're doing? What are the big things that we're focusing on? Clearly, what has been of concern to the United States recently was the protection of its space assets and satellites. When I say space assets, I truly mean satellites in general. So I'm going to say space assets from here on out. But for those assets, how we protect them is extremely important. For instance, if someone were to try to, an adversary were to try to knock out our GPS satellites, imagine the havoc that would wreak on our society. You wouldn't be able to get Uber Eats, right? I mean, it would just destroy America. But not only that, I mean, financial transactions, all these other things that are tied to our space assets that we use in our daily lives that we just don't see. And it's really important for us to protect those. Now, how we protect those, most of that is classified. And I think that's one of the difficulties with the Space Force is a vast majority of the things that it does is already classified and remains to be classified. It's really difficult to declassify things. So your public really doesn't know what you do, right? And I think that that there needs to be a little bit more transparency. I don't know how we would carry that out, but I think that it'll be interesting to see how that happens over the next few years. But in terms of new innovative space operations, there was an article that came out not too long ago about some nefarious maneuvers of a Russian satellite near our own. Russia said that this was I believe they call it a refueling mission of another satellite in the area, and the United States did not take it as such. And what we see there is there have been tests by China, Russia, with anti-satellite weaponry. I cannot speak to if those tests were carried out in orbit or if they were carried out from atmosphere to orbit, but nevertheless, the very fact that some countries are ramping up their anti-satellite weaponry is a case for why we need to find more innovative ways to protect our space assets. So that is kind of what is happening right now as we speak. And there's a lot of interesting things that are going on in what does the future hold. There are a lot of amazing people doing some awesome work with, we call it blue water strategy, blue water thinking. That comes from the term that navies in history are either blue water or brown water. And brown water means that they are closer to shore, obviously, where you get brackish water from fresh and seawater coming closer to the shoreline. Mixing it, it doesn't look as blue as, when you go out to deeper depths. And so brown water navy is one that generally sits closer to shore. They don't have the capability to send, a fleet all the way across the earth. And blue water is one where you can do that. And so there are some thinkers that we kind of dub them blue water thinkers in space that are coming up, and they're making some really interesting and innovative strategies and ideas for what's going to happen in the next few decades. So I'm not going to get too much into that right now. I think we can go into that later, but that is going to play heavily into military space operations.
I wanted to follow up, I guess, on what Eric said about the threats that we're facing. It is kind of difficult, right, to say on the one hand we have threats coming from the space domain, and as you mentioned, a lot of it is classified. When it comes to what opposing powers are developing, let's take China as an example. Erica, is without obviously going into the classified stuff, what do you think are some of the biggest threats, more specifically maybe on the technology side, that you find are particularly troublesome for U.S. domination in space?
Sure. So one thing that I find, and this is I'm going to answer your question, but I'm also going to do just a little quick twist with it. There's a lot of international competition that's popping up, predominantly, obviously, between China and the United States and her allies. And one thing that we actually see is different perspectives on space and the various bodies near Earth. That, I think, is where we differ the most. For instance, and I hope I don't get sacrificed if I do mess this up by your listeners. But there was an official within the Chinese National Space Agency. I think it was the deputy director. I could be completely wrong, but there was an official within the Chinese National Space Agency that equated the moon, near Earth objects, and Mars to the Diaoyu Islands. And if anybody has, read up on the Senkaku Island and Diaoyu Island dispute between China and Japan, it is exactly what I just said. It is a dispute. Japan believes that they call them the Senkaku Islands. That's their name in Japanese. That belongs to Japan. China calls it the Diaoyu Islands, and that belongs to China. China has in the past and currently been very agitated with those islands. They seem like they're willing to be very forceful with them, and saying something like, equating the moon, near Earth objects, and Mars to the Diaoyu Islands, when there's clearly a bitter dispute, is extremely concerning, particularly, for me, at least. When I see that, I get concerned with what are their intentions. I'm sure there are many scientists and engineers that are brilliant within China that would love to cooperate with us for the betterment of all humankind. But frankly, the government has other nefarious intentions, and I don't think that they would put the scientists and engineers' intentions first. I think they would put their own strategic intentions first, and it does seem to be that that's what they want to do, and that plays into exactly what you asked: the international competition for space technology. So with China and the United States, definitely the United States has an upper hand. It has a free market system that has allowed for entrepreneurship and the rapid growth of new space companies. By the way, new space is kind of a movement almost, but it's filled with a bunch of new startups that are innovative and groundbreaking. They're not necessarily your older, more traditional aerospace companies, but they have made some pretty big leaps in fairly short time. For instance, you see SpaceX, there's Blue Origin, but there's also smaller companies that focus on more nuanced technologies, such as, for instance, Astroscale. It's a startup out of Japan. They have a major office here in the United States, and they are trying to create technologies to clean up low Earth orbit. So I think that the United States and her allies does have a really good upper hand in technology. It has an environment that has built, an entrepreneurial mindset that I think is extremely beneficial. Now, when it comes to China and their space technology and Russia and their space technology, Russia, for instance, has, they have a lot of history and they have a lot of knowledge of space travel. They have always been involved in space, from the very beginning, in which we were in a heated space race with them. And they have been extremely successful. Yes, they have used the same rocket, general rocket family since the beginning, but they have at least been fairly successful in their operations, and they continue to do so. They continue to fund it, and they continue to go. Innovating in Russia, and by the way, I want to preface all of the stuff that I'm about to say. This is my personal opinion. This is not necessarily the opinion of the Space Force Association, the Space Force, or the United States government. But in my opinion, the way that Russia has created what my old professor, Dr. Andy Aldrin, said, there is a national space innovation system. There's something called a national innovation system, which is how a nation is essentially built its economy to be innovative, right? And there is a national space innovation system in every country. Russia's is, in my opinion, antiquated. They're not able to catch up to big players like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, who have been able to do some fairly interesting things, particularly, of course, as we have all seen, return a rocket booster and reuse it. Now, yes, there are, that doesn't mean that they're the best thing since sliced bread. There are some other major competitors like ULA out there that are doing some amazing work as well. But I do think that Russia's fairly behind. China, on the other hand, they understand that is a strong suit of the United States, and they are willing to change their economy or to change their national space innovation system to be more innovative and to compete. And they are willing to do so, and they will do it. Whether, if we continue down the path that we have started on or not, we will see what happens. But I guarantee you that China will continue to be innovative, and I wouldn't say that they've caught up to us yet, but they're sprinting towards us. So it's an interesting thing to watch, and it's an interesting thing to just see how this new space race is coming about.
Well, that's really interesting, Eric. I was just thinking of the analogy of the second space race. It certainly is a different world of different dynamics and different power structures occurring. It's very different to I guess this is called the first one with the Soviet Union at the time. One question I had was about protection of the space technology. I mean, you were mentioning about China and Russia. One of the big concerns that I have, and I think many people in this country have, is really protection of our technology. I really do think we are the hallmark nation of this brand new technology. We cannot afford to lose it to competitive or nefarious powers. Is there anything that you like to discuss about how we protect this technology? Because it seems like it's a multifaceted thing, isn't it? I mean, you have to protect the innovation part, maybe on the university research level. There's also, of course, there's the security of these facilities. Could you comment a bit about kind of the vision for protecting our space technology well into the future?
Yeah, of course. So, that is something that NASA has conducted for quite some time, is essentially an exclusion policy of Chinese nationals, particularly out of concern that technology could be stolen, and technology has been stolen. We have to be honest about that fact. China has stolen U.S. technology, re-engineered it, and used it and tested it to essentially compete with our technology. And so that is something that we do need to be concerned about. This is a realistic situation where, of course, we would want to have peace. Of course, we would want to work with any countries, around the world. And I believe that we should still engage diplomatically with China at every level. But we do need to be realistic here that they have stolen some of our technology and they will continue to do so. They do not care. And so that's something that we have. I think NASA has been somewhat effective at that. And remember, this is my opinion. I believe, the Space Force is doing very good work with that. As I did say, a lot of it is classified. A lot of the work that is done with private entities is actually very, very secure. A lot of the work that is done with our educational entities are still secure. There are concerns, and I understand those concerns, and I believe that those concerns are being addressed rapidly and effectively by both the Space Force, NASA, and just our national space industry. I think that we need to pay very close attention to that, and I would propose, to have a commission to just ensure that we do have security when it comes to our intellectual property. Not only that, but we generally operate in space in a coalition. We are not there by ourselves. We are there with many of our allies and, some of our closest allies, even regarding some Space Force operations, including Australia and the United Kingdom. We need to continue to maintain those relationships and work together to protect intellectual property, not only in the United States, but also with our allies. Because, like I said, we go to space with our allies. We never go to space without them. So we need to also be very well aware that our allies do need our assistance, and we need theirs when it comes to protecting intellectual property across the globe.
I think it's really well said. As someone who studied intelligence and homeland security back at the Bush School, it was just really important to emphasize that cooperation, as you were just mentioning, with some allies, which I would argue we have not maybe worked as closely as before. I'm not saying that we've broken off relations or have made relations worse, but maybe it's just a news kind of thing where we don't see a lot of these areas of cooperation as much as we do, let's say, Australia, the United Kingdom. And I personally, this is also my personal opinion, but I would love to see more cooperation with many of our intelligence partners, including the other four members of the Five Eyes. Five Eyes being the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I want to move on now to another topic here. You mentioned NASA before, and this begs a question about the role of the Space Force with regards to space exploration, which, at least when I was a kid, I think for many people as well, when you think of space exploration, it's just such a cool concept and a cool area to go into. It seemed like half of my classmates at the time, when I was a lot younger, wanted to be astronauts or wanted to be involved in something space related. It really is an exciting areas. So Eric, what is the relationship between the SFA or the Space Force and NASA or NASA related organizations? What areas of cooperation would you say are most important to know?
Yeah, of course. So to preface that, one quick, really cool thing is tomorrow, November 14th, Colonel Michael Hopkins is going to be launching off in the first operational crew launch of the SpaceX Dragon capsule. And he is going to be, I believe, in orbit, sworn into the Space Force as a colonel. So we will actually already have our first Space Force astronaut in orbit, which is going to be really awesome and fun to watch. To answer your question, I want to point your listeners to a memorandum of understanding between NASA and the Space Force that came out very recently. So they signed on to this memorandum of understanding, and they decided that there were some major cooperative areas that they wanted to focus on, such as deep space surveying. So that means that they're going to be looking far into deep space at objects, signals, different things like that. For various reasons, such as planetary defense. And when I say planetary defense, I mean the protection of our planet from something like an asteroid. They also are interested in fostering capabilities that enable safe and sustained near Earth and cislunar operations. That includes communications, navigation, servicing of space assets, space structures. And from manufacturing to just operations in general, it's going to be really interesting there. They also want to work together on search and rescue and recovery operations for human spaceflight. That's an interesting point in which I think has a lot of discussion of, well, if that's what they're looking at, is that just on Earth or is it off Earth? I've heard a lot of people ask me that question, and I think when this was written, they had the intention for on Earth, but I can guarantee you, the lines will be blurred in the future. They also go into launch support, supply, ride share, just different things like that. And I think that was a really good basis for a memorandum of understanding. I think it was a really good basis of a relationship that's going to continue far into the future. There has been some discussion of making NASA's Kennedy Space Center just one, a section of the Cape Canaveral, currently Air Force Station. I think it's going to end up becoming a Space Force base in the coming future, and that would be a complete Space Force facility. That goes again to your point that we just discussed about security. The Space Force will be able to obviously secure it militarily, which might make it more secure than what NASA was doing. I'm not going to get into that debate of should that be happening, which should be running that, but I do think that could actually alleviate some logistics for NASA so they can carry out their mission even more effectively. But at the end of the day, I think that relationship is going to be very interesting. There's a lot of theories about what's going to happen with the Space Force far in the future. This is both my opinion and it's also my hope is that the Space Force will become an entity that conducts peaceful space exploration and security. And that is me thinking very, very long term. Hopefully my great grandchildren will get to see that. But I do think that that's possible. And if anybody says that having a military service do that is bad, I think is never read a history book.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Eric. And when you think about the developments of technology, you think about the mandates that we are given as the American people, be able not only to expand on technology and space exploration, it also seems like we are also going to affirm American values. It's just because it's the domain of space doesn't mean that other rival countries can just claim planets or claim areas of space. I mean, there's probably a whole other discussion when it comes down to international law on space. And I think that's going to be on the radar for a lot of lawyers out there and a lot of people maybe working on international legislation. Maybe the United Nations will take on it. I don't know, but I just want to put it out there. I want to now move on to our kind of really wrapping all of this. You've talked a lot about all of these policies and these areas that you're working on, and I want to now ask Nick about the efforts that the SFA is taking to bring this to the representatives of the United States, which I think is such a significant development. And I'm really glad that this is now coming forth as we progress through in the early stages of the Space Force. So Nick, can you walk us through some of those congressional efforts that you and Eric have been working on, but also talk a bit about some of the responses and the reactions that you've gotten as you've continued your work on behalf of SFA?
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I'll speak on that. But I wanted to touch on an earlier point about space exploration real quick, and then I'll get into the legislative stuff. regarding space exploration, one of the huge advances we had recently was when NASA, the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft successfully got a sample of the asteroid Bennu. That was just a huge, huge leap forward for both NASA and the space community as well. So, we were paying close attention to that. And in 2023, we'll be able to read those samples. But now onto the question you asked me regarding our efforts in the House and the Senate. We started in the Senate first. The ball had already sort of been rolling with one of the U.S. senators we were working with Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado. So we met with him by phone, of course, to get that off the ground. And then we worked with his top staffers after that to get the Space Force started. The caucus formed. They, of course, had to file the paperwork. But what we did on our end was we got the senators together. We said, how about Senator so-and-so, Senator so-and-so, and said, okay, yeah, I've worked with them before. Okay, yeah, let's get them together. Let's see if we can get co-chairs. And we wanted this to be as bipartisan as we could get it. We didn't want this to be a Democratic effort or a Republican effort solely. We wanted this to be as bipartisan as we could. So we have two Republicans, two Democrats, which is great that they were able to come together like that. Then moving on to the House, we did the same thing. We partnered with several members of Congress, got them together. A lot of them were members that I had worked with last year on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. So I utilized some of the relationships I had made last year, which was a huge help, I think, because, it gives some clout. I'm one of you. I worked in the House. That's just how it works. As you know, it's a very tight knit community. So I used a lot of the relationships I made on the Science Committee, and that really helped us get a lot of co-chairs together. It, of course, the lead chair is Congressman Doug Lamborn, who represents Colorado Springs. So we've been working closely with his staff members and then several other members of Congress. A few from Texas, but really all around, and a good bipartisan support for this, which is great if you can get anything bipartisan nowadays. But we've had a warm reception to it. We've been able to get pretty far in this. So now that the caucuses are created, we just still meet with these members and senators and give them any kind of resources that they need, anything that we can help do on our end is what we're here for. So Eric and I work with our colleagues in the Space Force Association to get whatever representative or senator if a bit of information they need, and we've been doing that over the last several months. So that's what we do, and that's what we've been working on with the Space Force caucuses. This is the first time a new military caucus has been created since after World War II with the Air Force caucus. So this is we're in a brand new territory, trying to explore ourselves. So it's been really fun because this hasn't really been done in a very long time.
Sure. And a question about the caucus itself. Now, each caucus is different. There's hundreds of caucuses. Some are inactive, some are really, really prominent. But each caucus has a different format. Some are more of just like a membership thing where the member of Congress can say, I'm signing on to such and such, while others are a bit more formal. They have meetings, they have at least staff meetings and member meetings and things like that. How do you see the format of the caucus as you welcome a new Congress in, as you expand with more members, as the Space Force grows? What is the intended or visionary format you see for this particular caucus in Congress?
The House caucus is brand new. It's less than a month old since the paperwork was approved by the House Administration Committee. So, of course, with the election going on, I don't think it's been fairly dormant, of course, as many other caucuses have been because of the election. I see it really picking up at the start of the new Congress. But yes, this, of course, as you know, but your listeners may not, that a caucus has no legal authority, right? So all legislation in Congress forms out of committees. So each piece of legislation has to be sponsored by a committee. So this caucus has no authority to draft legislation. It's more of a group of like-minded representatives. I think we're up to 20 members of Congress on the House Space Force Caucus right now, which is great. That's a really, really solid number of representatives. Most caucuses have 3 or 4 members that just all are all into the same thing. But this caucus will be more. It'll have more functions than the House Whiskey Caucus or the House, caucus. The people that like certain types of music, they're all out there. But certain caucuses, mainly the Armed Forces caucuses, do more. It's where these members can come together and really discuss legislative ideas, policy ideas that they can take back to their respective committees that can draft the legislation. It's really for them to come together, talk about Space Force ideas. They can bring in, members of the Space Force itself. They can bring us in if they need us to clarify policy matters for them. But it's growing more and more by the day, especially with the election being over and a new Congress starting. I think it'll just blossom next year.
One final question, Nick, before I get to the kind of the wrap-up sort of question that I usually ask our guests at the end of the episode. Nick, in the bio, I mentioned the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2019, HR 3610. Can you talk about what that legislation was? I think that's really cool that you got to be a part of that in the actual drafting and working with the staff. So I just want to give you a chance to explain what that legislation is and what it would do if passed.
So what it is it mainly deals with, well, it's multifaceted, right? It's not just a single piece of legislation. It's more of a combination of a lot of different space pieces. It's mostly focused on space commercialization. But the part I worked on last year as an intern, which was a really cool experience because most interns don't get to do policy work. But because of my background at the Bush School and, coming with that education, I got to do more legislative and policy work. So what I did was I researched what's called remote sensing. So remote sensing satellites are satellites like Google Earth or military satellites that do Earth imagery. They also do space imagery like other galaxies and the moon, but it's mostly Earth-centric remote sensing. In commercial remote sensing is what Google Earth uses to view images of the Earth. So the law that was on the books previously was from 1992, before the internet age, and that mostly dealt with what's called the Landsat program. Landsat satellites, which have been around since the early 80s, late 70s, I believe, and are still around. I think it's on its 8th or 9th satellite now. They're military satellite imagery satellites. So the only law on the books had to do with military satellites. It hadn't left room for commercial space imagery satellites, because in 1992, who could have thought that we'd have Google Earth, right? So there wasn't any regulation of commercial remote sensing satellites because the Landsat law was the only one on the books. So what I did was I researched the updated policy pieces of commercial remote sensing. to update and to accommodate for current commercial satellites dealing with Earth imagery, which is mainly Google Earth. Bing has one as well, but there are others, but that's the main one. So, I didn't mention Google by name in the bill. It's to accommodate those commercial satellites. And I worked on this bill for six or 8 weeks, poured my heart and soul into it. It was introduced into the committee. The bill died in committee, as we say, because I worked on the Republican minority and there's a Democratic majority. So it wasn't that it wasn't a good bill. It's just, pork barrel spending and all that. There just wasn't enough earmarks for the Democratic members. So it's still a proud achievement of mine legislatively, but it was not passed.
Yeah, I think that's that's just part of the process, right? I mean, there's the inner working,
the ebbs and flows of
right.
legislative
That's
work
right.
in Congress.
I think despite what had happened, I think you should be really proud. I remember you sharing with me your experiences when we were both on the Hill at the same time last summer. And I hope that I had that kind of experience. I had a great time myself, but to be able to work on that is really remarkable. So I just want to acknowledge that for sure.
Thank you.
Well, now let's kind of wrap things up a bit. I want to kind of reflect a bit on our discussion today. I'll start with Eric this time. Eric, in our podcast, we discuss a lot about Washington's principles. I've outlined 6 principles in this podcast to help us get better in terms of a society, in terms of a politics world. We've seen everything from political polarization to even some instances of anti-Americanism, and there's just a number of cracks, I think, in the system. I think these 6 principles can get us closer to that. And the 6 principles are patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, and civility. So based on our discussion today and your personal experience, what can the U.S. government and the American people do to live out even just one or more of those values that I just mentioned?
Yeah. So I checked out your podcast when Nick introduced me to it. So I saw that was one of the primary things that you really like to touch on at the end. And I want to thank you for that, because I do think that we need to get back to some of these principles. And I think that Americans, no matter their political leanings, need to look at these and understand that we're Americans first, and we need to put that before our feelings of our neighbors. And I think that I don't want to be that dude that constantly talks about space, but I'm actually going to tie it back in here in just a couple ways. I think that the government in many instances is generally trying to do good. Now we've all heard the phrase that the path to hell is paved in good intentions, right? But I think one way that they could at least push both industry and the American people to look beyond is by supporting space wholeheartedly, putting it at one of the front, at the front of the so-called government bus. I like to say there's so many things that the government focuses on, and a lot of things take the back seat, right? But I think that if you could put space further to the front seat, I think a lot of people are going to start to see how it can play into things like patriotism and education. But most importantly, I think that it could play into national unity. I think that that's one of the most important things that we do need. That, no matter who you vote for, no matter who you elect, a politician isn't going to automatically unify people. They're going to have their political opinions and persuasions. I think that if we put the development of space at the forefront, I think that won't just give us a national unity. That can give us even to an extent, some form of international unity. That does not mean that we're all going to sing Kumbaya and be best friends and never have a conflict. But I think that it can make us realize that we do live on a very small, pale blue dot, and we're all in this together. And most importantly, our nation, we need to have that mentality first and foremost for our nation, for our country. And I think that space is one way that we can do that. I think the government needs to focus on that. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to spend a majority of its funding on it, but it does need to put it at the forefront, and it needs to, we need to get back to the times in which, we inspire both our children and our adults, people of all ages, with what we're going to be doing in space in the near future, not the far future, but the near future. There will be people on the moon, and there will be someone on Mars, hopefully by the time that I'm an old man. And I think that, by the time my great grandchildren are old, there will be cities on other celestial bodies. So I think that we need to put that at the forefront. But I'm going to turn it over to Nick to answer that question, if that's what you'd like.
I strongly, definitely agree with what Eric said as well. But I think space is something that, while it tends to get political, the end goal is always the same, to see what's out there beyond our Earth, to make sure that, everything is safe and secure, that our astronauts get to and fro the space station safely. So that's really our solid objective, is to make sure that we're, really tight, have a firm grasp on our space issues. And something of a sense of national unity is when, earlier in the year, in May, when the SpaceX Dragon capsule, launched 2 astronauts to the space station and brought them back. That was a really sense of strong national unity. Eric and I tried to watch it together, but the launch got scrubbed. The original date, and they got moved back multiple times. So we tried to watch it live, but I think that was a good sense of national unity that I haven't seen in a while, at least in our field. And that's what I can speak to on that.
Yeah, I'll never forget that, watching live from the comfort of my home, but also in 2019, of course, that marked 50 years since Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, stepped foot on the moon. And I was down in the National Mall with the crowd of Americans just watching the presentation in our nation's capital. It was a really incredible experience, and I think that's been one of my most recent memories of being unified with my fellow citizens. And
did you get to see the Saturn V?
I did, yeah.
Projected onto the Washington Monument. That was one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my life.
That's right. I was in a good position, I think. I was right in front of the castle, the Smithsonian Castle, so I had a pretty good view. But it felt like a holiday. It really did. I think it would be great to have a holiday to commemorate space exploration. I think that'd be really great, especially great for.
I agree.
If it's on a weekday or something, I think it'd be a great time for kids across the nation and families to visit NASA facilities, to go to these science museums to learn about space. I think that'd be. I would propose that. Maybe that'll be a bill that I put out on the.
It was a huge achievement in human history. Straight up during the Cold War and during Vietnam, everybody kind of put their arms and differences aside and came together as one, globe, as one planet. We haven't had something like that happen in a very long time.
And I agree. I mean, I saw the same stuff. I was at Johnson Space Center that night and throughout the day. And I saw the same thing that you did. I mean, there were many people, and I'm sure this was the case in Washington as well, where you had many people from other countries even showing up and waving American flags, and that was that was something that, for a very short time during an extremely difficult era, that everybody stopped and was able to watch and realize the gravity of what just happened. Realize, that we are no longer just a species that has been on this earth. We've left and we've gone somewhere else. And I think that the biggest mistake, one of the biggest mistakes that our country has done, was to not commit itself to continuing that endeavor, and that we pulled back from it. We realized that it was a thing of pride. Now we're realizing it's not only a thing of pride; it's a thing of national strategy. It's a thing of our economy, and also our future, both on this planet and off, is going to depend, obviously, on space exploration. So I think that all of those tied together could be a unifying force.
Really well said. Really well said. I want to now ask one quick final question. As you know, the title "Friends and Fellow Citizens" the first few words of George Washington's farewell address. And I'm going to ask Nick first, and I'll ask Eric to follow up. Nick, throughout your life, has there ever been a founding father that you felt was most interesting, or perhaps a personal favorite of yours?
James Madison. I've always been I wouldn't call myself a constitutional scholar. I'd call myself a constitutional wonk, if you want to put it that way. I love the wording of the Constitution. I guess you can throw Thomas Jefferson in there as well for the Declaration. I just love the way. What? Eric and I.
He stole mine. He stole it.
I take back Thomas Jefferson and stick with James Madison. I love the way that the Constitution and the preamble are written. A lot of people put that up to debate, whether you're a textualist or, I don't want to get into that stuff. But James Madison, I think, is an underrepresented founding father. So I've always felt akin to him. For his role in the founding, so that's my answer. Sorry.
Great.
Now Eric would like to speak.
All right.
No, that's no problem. I agree with him on that. James Madison is how did you put it? Underappreciated. He's definitely an underappreciated figure and founding father. My favorite founding father is Thomas Jefferson. I have always felt that way. His dedication to our values of our republic, and to the realization of that the individual matters, that we shouldn't have a tyranny of a king, and we also shouldn't have a tyranny of a majority either. He embodied that, and I think that I think that we need to read a little bit more Thomas Jefferson sometimes. Along with some James Madison, I do think that we should be reading some of that as well in our for our younger generations, and hopefully they'll be having a good civics education, in the coming years. I do hope, but that would be my answer to that question.
If your listeners want to know more about the founding fathers, I highly recommend the HBO ministry John Adams. It's one of my favorites.
Classic.
I recently rewatched it about a month ago, and it's one of the best. So if your listeners want to look more into that, they should watch the HBO ministry.
I would say I see your question here. We have it pulled up, and you did ask, what is your most interesting or favorite founding father? I will say interesting. He's not my most favorite, no offense to him, but I do find Alexander Hamilton to be an extremely interesting individual. Just his life is just it's interesting to read. It's interesting to study. But nevertheless, it's hard to break down who's most interesting. They were all very, very interesting.
Don't tell Aaron Burr that.
Yeah. Don't tell Aaron Burr that. I apologize to Aaron Burr and his descendants. That was of no offense to you, but
just kidding, Aaron Burr.
I think Alexander Hamilton was secretly the one who made the musical just so you can try to sway the Jefferson supporters like yourself, Eric.
He didn't sway me. He didn't sway me. I'm an ardent Jefferson supporter. I'm an ardent Jeffersonian. So, and that's going to remain forever.
Very, very good. Very good. Well, real quick, how can people learn more about the Space Force and the Space Force Association?
Do look us up. We have a website. It's ussfa.org. You can, go on social media, follow us at Space Force Association on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. One last thing, and LinkedIn. And one last thing that I do want to say is, if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in becoming involved, or if you simply just want to know more about the Space Force in general, we have some great educational programs and materials. We actually just created the Space Force Journal, which is an academic journal that's going to be publishing short articles and long journalistic article pieces. And we're really excited about that. But nevertheless, you can go on our site. You can go on to a sign up form, and there's actually the possibility of becoming a mentor or a mentee. If you're a mentor, generally you have some sort of experience in space operations. If you're a mentee, you could be new to it. You could be wanting to go into it. We have that program, so we can get the word out and get people involved.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both so much, and not just for being on this episode today, sharing your expertise or your knowledge, but really just the work you're doing with the Space Force Association. As I emphasized before, I think this is important work, and there's no doubt that over time, and my feeling is this, over time, as the Space Force really becomes even a greater part of our politics and our culture, I think I would argue our civic religions, shall we say, the kind of the customs and the values that are associated with it. I think you're going to see more engagement, and I hope that's the case. And I think it's because of people like yourself, Eric, and yourself, Nick, and your team, and all the members who are part of the caucus, and as well as the American people who play a huge role in making this a success. So I want to thank you both for coming on this show today.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, Sherman. Thanks for the invite. Fantastic.
I will leave the links in the description below, so I will work with Eric and Nick on that, but I really appreciate it. I think people would want to know more about the SFA and more about the Space Force, so I really appreciate that. And that will wrap up our episode today. Again, make sure you subscribe and share this podcast and episode with your friends and family. Until next week, take care, have a great day and week, and I'll see you next time.